Popular Government. Sir Henry Sumner Maine. 1885. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Essay 1. The Prospects of Popular Government. The blindness of the privileged classes in France to the revolution which was about to overwhelm them furnishes some of the best-worn commonplaces of modern history. There was no doubt much in it to surprise us. What king, noble, and priest could not see had been easily visible to the foreign observer. In short, runs the famous passage in Chesterfield's letter of December 25, 1753, all the symptoms which I ever met with in history previous to great changes and revolutions in government now exist and daily increase in France. A large number of writers of our day, manifesting the wisdom which comes after the event, have pointed out that the signs of a terrible time ought not to have been mistaken. The court, the aristocracy, and the clergy should have understood that, in face of the irreligion which was daily becoming more fashionable, the belief in privilege conferred by birth could not be long maintained. They should have noted the portents of imminent political disturbance and the intense jealousy of classes. They should have been prepared for a tremendous social upheaval by the squalor and misery of the peasants. They should have observed the immediate causes of revolution in the disorder of the finances and in the gross inequality of taxation. They should have been wise enough to know that the entire structure, of which the keystone was a stately and scandalous court, was undermined on all sides. Beautiful Armida Palace, where the inmates live enchanted lives, lapped in soft music of adulation, waited on by the splendors of the world, which nevertheless hangs wondrously as by a single hair. But although Chesterfield appeals to history, the careful modern student of history will perhaps think the blindness of the French nobility and clergy eminently pardonable. The monarchy, under whose broad shelter all privilege grew and seemed to thrive, appeared to have its roots deeper in the past than any existing European institution. The countries which now made up France had enjoyed no experience of popular government since the rude Gaulish freedom. From this, they had passed into the condition of a strictly administered, strongly governed, highly taxed, Roman province. The investigations of the young and learned school of historians rising in France leave it questionable whether the Germans, who are sometimes supposed to have redeemed their own barbarism by reviving liberty, brought anything like freedom to Gaul. There was little more than a succession of German to Roman privileged classes. German captains shared the great estates, and assumed the rank, of the half-official, half-hereditary nobility, who abounded in the province. A German king, who was in reality only a Roman general bearing a barbarous title, reigned over much of Gaul and much of Central Europe. When his race was supplanted by another in its kingship, the new power got itself decorated with the old Roman imperial style, and when at length a third dynasty arose, the monarchy associated with it gradually developed more vigor and vitality than any other political institution in Europe. From the accession of Hugh Capet to the French Revolution, there had been as nearly as possible 800 years. During all this time, the French royal house had steadily gained in power. It had wearied out and beaten back the victorious armies of England. It had emerged stronger than ever from the wars of religion which humbled English kingship in the dust, dealing it a blow from which it never thoroughly recovered. It had grown in strength, authority, and splendor, till it dazzled all eyes. It had become the model for all princes. Nor had its government and its relation to its subjects struck all men as they seem to have struck Chesterfield. 11 years before Chesterfield wrote, David Hume, a careful observer of France, had thus written in 1742, though all kinds of government be improved in modern times, yet monarchical government seems to have made the greatest advance to perfection. It may now be affirmed of civilized monarchies, what was formerly said of republics alone, that they are a government of laws, not of men. They are found susceptible of order, method, and constancy, to a surprising degree. Property is there secure, industry is encouraged, the arts flourish, and the prince lives among his subjects like a father among his children. And Hume expressly adds that he saw more sources of degeneracy in free governments like England than in France, the most perfect model of pure monarchy. Nevertheless, Hume was unquestionably wrong in his conclusion, and Chesterfield was as unquestionably right. The French privileged classes might conceivably have foreseen the Great Revolution, simply because it happened. The time, however, which is expended in wondering at their blindness, or in pitying it with an air of superior wisdom, is as nearly as possible wasted. Next to what a modern satirist has called hypothetics, the science of that which might have happened but did not, there is no more unprofitable study than the investigation of the possibly predictable, which was never predicted. It is of far higher advantage to note the mental condition of the French upper classes as one of the most remarkable facts in history, and to ask ourselves whether it conveys a caution to other generations than theirs. This line of speculation is at the least interesting. We too, who belong to Western Europe towards the end of the 19th century, live under a set of institutions which all, except a small minority, regard as likely to be perpetual. 9 men out of 10, some hoping, some fearing, Look upon the popular government which, ever widening its basis, has spread and is still spreading over the world, as destined to last forever, or, if it changes its form, to change it in one single direction. The democratic principle has gone forth conquering and to conquer, and its gainsayers are few and feeble. Some Catholics, from whose minds the diplomacy of the present Pope has not banished the syllabus of the last, a fairly large body of French and Spanish legitimists, and a few aged courtiers in the small circles surrounding exiled German and Italian princes, may still believe that the cloud of democratic ascendancy will pass away. Their hopes may be as vain as their regrets, but nevertheless those who recollect the surprises which the future had in store for men equally confident in the perpetuity of the present, will ask themselves whether it is really true that the expectation of virtual permanence for governments of the modern type rests upon solid grounds of historical experience as regards the past, and of rational probability as regards the time to come. I endeavor in these pages to examine the question in a spirit different from that which animates most of those who view the advent of democracy either with enthusiasm or with despair. Out of the many names commonly applied to the political system prevailing or tending to prevail in all the civilized portions of the world, I have chosen popular government as the name which, on the whole, is least open to objection. It will be seen that I endeavor to use the term democracy, throughout this volume, in its proper and only consistent sense, that is, for a particular form of government. But what we are witnessing in West European politics is not so much the establishment of a definite system, as the continuance, at varying rates, of a process. The truth is that, within 200 years, the view taken of government, or, as the jurists say, of the relation of sovereign to subject, of political superior to political inferior, has been changing, sometimes partially and slowly, sometimes generally and rapidly. The character of this change has been described by John Stuart Mill in the early pages of his essay on liberty, and more recently by Mr. Justice Stephen, who in his History of the Criminal Law of England very strikingly uses the contrast between the old and the new view of government to illustrate the difference between two views of the law of seditious libel. I will quote the latter passage as less colored than the language of Mill by the special preferences of the writer. Two different views may be taken, says Sir James Stephen, of the relation between rulers and their subjects. If the ruler is regarded as the superior of the subject, as being by the nature of his position presumably wise and good, the rightful ruler and guide of the whole population, it must necessarily follow that it is wrong to censure him openly, and, even if he is mistaken, his mistakes should be pointed out with the utmost respect, and that, whether mistaken or not, no censure should be cast on him likely or designed to diminish his authority. If, on the other hand, the ruler is regarded as the agent and servant, and the subject as the wise and good master, who is obliged to delegate his power to the so-called ruler because, being a multitude, he cannot use it himself, it must be evident that this sentiment must be reversed. Every member of the public who censures the ruler for the time being exercises in his own person the right which belongs to the whole of which he forms a part. He is finding fault with his own servant. The states of Europe are now regulated by political institutions answering to the various stages of the transition from the old view, that rulers are presumably wise and good, the rightful rulers and guides of the whole population, to the newer view, that the ruler is the agent and servant, and the subject the wise and good master, who is obliged to delegate his power to the so-called ruler because, being a multitude, he cannot use it himself. Russia and Turkey are the only European states which completely reject the theory that governments hold their powers by delegation from the community, the word community being somewhat vaguely understood, but tending more and more to mean at least the whole of the males of full age living within certain territorial limits. This theory, which is known on the continent as the theory of national sovereignty, has been fully accepted in France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Holland, Belgium, Greece, and the Scandinavian states. In Germany it has been repeatedly repudiated by the emperor and his powerful minister, but it is to a very great extent acted upon. England, as is not unusual with her, stands by herself. There is no country in which the newer view of government is more thoroughly applied to practice, but almost all the language of the law and constitution is still accommodated to the older ideas concerning the relation of ruler and subject. But, although no such inference could be drawn from English legal phraseology, there is no doubt that the modern popular government of our day is of purely English origin. When it came into existence, there were republics in Europe, but they exercised no moral and little political influence. Although in point of fact they were most of them strict oligarchies, they were regarded as somewhat plebeian governments, over which monarchies took rightful precedence. The republics in Europe, writes Hume in 1742, are at present noted for want of politeness. The good manners of a Swiss civilized in Holland is an expression for rusticity among the French. The English in some degree fall under the same censure, notwithstanding their learning and genius. And if the Venetians be an exception, they owe it perhaps to their communication with other Italians. If a man then called himself a republican, he was thinking of the Athenian or Roman Republic, one for a while in a certain sense a democracy, the other from first to last an aristocracy, but both ruling a dependent empire with the utmost severity. In reality, the new principle of government was solely established in England, which Hume always classes with republics rather than with monarchies. After tremendous civil struggles, the doctrine that government served the community was, in spirit if not in words, affirmed in 1689. But it was long before this doctrine was either fully carried out by the nation or fully accepted by its rulers. William III was merely a foreign politician and general, who submitted to the eccentricities of his subjects for the sake of using their wealth and arms in foreign war. On this point the admissions of Macaulay are curiously in harmony with the view of William taken in the instructions of Louis XIV. To his diplomatists which have lately been published. And certainly believed in her own quasi-divine right, and George I and George II were humbler kings of the same type as William, who thought that the proper and legitimate form of government was to be found, not in England, but in Hanover. As soon as England had in George III a king who cared more for English politics than for foreign war, he repudiated the doctrine altogether, nor can it be said that it was really admitted by any English sovereign until, possibly, the present reign. But even when the horror of the French Revolution was at its highest, the politician, who would have been in much danger of prosecution if he had toasted the people as the sole legitimate source of power, could always save himself by drinking to the principles which placed the House of Hanover on the throne. These principles in the meantime were more and more becoming the actual rule of government, and before George III died they had begun their victorious march over Europe. Popular government, as first known to the English, began to command the interest of the continent through the admiration with which it inspired a certain set of French thinkers towards the middle of the last century. At the outset, it was not English liberty which attracted them, but English toleration and also English irreligion, the last one of the most fugitive phases through which the mind of a portion of the nation passed, but one which so struck the foreign observer that, at the beginning of the present century, we find Napoleon Bonaparte claiming the assistance of the Pope as rightfully his because he was the enemy of the British misbeliever. Gradually the educated classes of France, at whose feet sat the educated class of all continental countries, came to interest themselves in English political institutions, and then came two events, one of which greatly encouraged, while the other in the end greatly discouraged, the tendency of popular government to diffuse itself. The first of them was the foundation of the United States. The American Constitution is distinctively English. This might be proved alone, as Mr. Freeman has acutely observed, by its taking two houses, instead of one, or three, or more, as the normal structure of a legislative assembly. It is in fact the English Constitution carefully adapted to a body of Englishmen who had never had much to do with an hereditary king and an aristocracy of birth, and who had determined to dispense with them altogether. The American Republic has greatly influenced the favor into which popular government grew. It disproved the once universal assumptions, that no republic could govern a large territory, and that no strictly republican government could be stable. But at first the republic became interesting for other reasons. It now became possible for continental Europeans to admire popular government without submitting to the somewhat bitter necessity of admiring the English, who till lately had been the most unpopular of European nations. Frenchmen in particular, who had helped and perhaps enabled the Americans to obtain their independence, naturally admired institutions which were indirectly their own creation, and Frenchmen who had not served in the American War saw the American freeman reflected in Franklin, who pleased the school of Voltaire because he believed nothing, and the school of Rousseau because he wore a Quaker coat. The other event strongly influencing the fortunes of popular government was the French Revolution, which in the long run rendered it an object of horror. The French, in their new constitutions, followed first the English and then the American model, but in both cases with large departures from the originals. The result in both cases was miserable miscarriage. Political liberty took long to recover from the discredit into which it had been plunged by the Reign of Terror. In England, detestation of the Revolution did not cease to influence politics till 1830. But, abroad, there was a reaction to the older type of popular government in 1814 and 1815, and it was thought possible to combine freedom and order by copying, with very slight changes, the British Constitution. From a longing for liberty, combined with a loathing of the French experiments in it, there sprang the state of opinion in which the constitutional movements of the continent had their birth. The British political model was followed by France, by Spain and Portugal, and by Holland and Belgium, combined in the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and, after a long interval, by Germany, Italy, and Austria. The principle of modern popular government was thus affirmed less than 2 centuries ago, and the practical application of that principle outside these islands and their dependencies is not quite a century old. What has been the political history of the commonwealths in which this principle has been carried out in various degrees? The inquiry is obviously one of much importance and interest, but, though the materials for it are easily obtained, and indeed are to a large extent within the memory of living men, it is very seldom or very imperfectly prosecuted. I undertake it solely with the view of ascertaining, within reasonable limits of space, how far actual experience countenances the common assumption of our day, that popular government is likely to be of indefinitely long duration. I will first take France, which began with the imitation of the English, and has ended with the adoption of the American model. Since the introduction of political freedom into France, the existing government, nominally clothed with all the powers of the state, has been 3 times overturned by the mob of Paris, in 1792, in 1830, and in 1848. It has been 3 times overthrown by the army, first in 1797, on the 4th of September, 18 Fructidor, when the majority of the directors with the help of the soldiery annulled the elections of 48 departments, and deported 56 members of the 2 assemblies, condemning also to deportation 2 of their own colleagues. The second military revolution was effected by the elder Bonaparte on the 9th of November, 18 Brumaire, 1799, and the third by the younger Bonaparte, on December 2, 1851. The French government has also been 3 times destroyed by foreign invasion, in 1814, 1815, and 1870, the invasion having been in each case provoked by French aggression, sympathized in by the bulk of the French people. In all, putting aside the anomalous period from 1870 to 1885, France, since she began her political experiments, has had 44 years of liberty and 37 of stern dictatorship. But it has to be remembered, and it is one of the curiosities of this period of history, that the elder Bourbons, who in practice gave very wide room to political freedom, did not expressly admit the modern theory of popular government, while the Bonapartes, who proclaimed the theory without qualification, maintained in practice a rigid despotism. Popular government was introduced into Spain just when the fortune of war was declaring itself decisively in favor of Wellington and the English army. The extraordinary Cortes signed at Cadiz a constitution, since then famous in Spanish politics as the Constitution of 1812, which proclaimed in its first article that sovereignty resided in the nation. Ferdinand VII, on re-entering Spain from France, repudiated this constitution, denouncing it as Jacobinical, and for about 6 years he reigned as absolutely as any of his forefathers. But in 1820 General Riego, who was in command of a large force stationed near Cadiz, headed a military insurrection in which the mob joined, and the king submitted to the Constitution of 1812. In 1823 the foreign invader appeared, the French armies entered Spain at the instigation of the Holy Alliance, and re-established Ferdinand's despotism, which lasted till his death. Popular government was, however, reintroduced by his widow as regent for his daughter, no doubt for the purpose of strengthening Isabella's title to the throne against her uncle, Don Carlos. It is probably unnecessary to give the subsequent political history of Spain in any detail. There are some places in South America where the people date events, not from the great earthquakes, but from the years in which, by a rare intermission, there is no earthquake at all. On the same principle we may note that during the 9 years following 1845, and the 9 years following 1857, there was comparative, though not complete, freedom from military insurrection in Spain. As to the residue of her political history, my calculation is that between the first establishment of popular government in 1812 and the accession of the present king, there have been 40 military risings of a serious nature, in most of which the mob took part. 9 of them were perfectly successful, either overthrowing the constitution for the time being, or reversing the principles on which it was administered. I need hardly say that both the Queen Regent, Christina, and her daughter Isabella, were driven out of Spain by the army or the fleet, with the help of the mob, and that the present king, Alfonso, was placed on the throne through a military pronunciamiento at the end of 1874. It is generally thought that he owes his retention of it since 1875 to statesmanship of a novel kind. As soon as he has assured himself that the army is in earnest, he changes his ministers. The real beginning of popular or parliamentary government in Germany and the Austrian dominions, other than Hungary, cannot be placed earlier than 1848. The interest of German politics from 1815 to that year consists in the complaints, ever growing fainter, of the German communities who sought to compel the princes to redeem their promises of constitutions made during the War of Independence, and of the efforts of the princes to escape or evade their pledges. Francis II expressed the prevailing feeling in his own way when he said to the Hungarian Diet, "Totus mundus stultizat, et vult habere novas constitutions." With some exceptions in the smaller states there were no parliamentary institutions in Germany till the King of Prussia conceded, just before 1848, the singular form of constitutional government which did not survive that year. But as soon as the mob of Paris had torn up the French constitutional charter, and expelled the constitutional king, mobs, with their usual accompaniment the army, began to influence German and even Austrian politics. National assemblies, on the French pattern, were called together at Berlin, at Vienna, and at Frankfurt. All of them were dispersed in about a year, and directly or indirectly by the army. The more recent German and Austrian constitutions are all of royal origin. Taking Europe as a whole, the most durably successful experiments in popular government have been made either in small states, too weak for foreign war, such as Holland and Belgium, or in countries, like the Scandinavian states, where there was an old tradition of political freedom. The ancient Hungarian constitution has been too much affected by civil war for any assertion about it to be safe. Portugal, for a while scarcely less troubled than Spain by military insurrection, has been free from it of late, and Greece has had the dynasty of her kings once changed by revolution. If we look outside Europe and beyond the circle of British dependencies, the phenomena are much the same. The Civil War of 1861-65, in the United States, was as much a war of revolution as the War of 1775 to 1782. It was a war carried on by the adherents of one set of principles and one construction of the Constitution against the adherents of another body of principles and another constitutional doctrine. It would be absurd, however, to deny the relative stability of the government of the United States, which is a political fact of the first importance, but the inferences which might be drawn from it are much weakened, if not destroyed, by the remarkable spectacle furnished by the numerous republics set up from the Mexican borderline to the Straits of Magellan. It would take many of these pages even to summarize the whole political history of the Spanish-American communities. There have been entire periods of years during which some of them have been disputed between the multitude and the military, and again when tyrants, as brutal as Caligula or Commodus, reigned over them like a Roman emperor in the name of the Roman people. It may be enough to say of one of them, Bolivia, which was recently heard of through her part in the war on the Pacific coast, that out of 14 presidents of the Bolivian Republic 13 have died assassinated or in exile. There is one partial explanation of the inattention of English and European politicians to a most striking, instructive, and uniform body of facts. Spanish, though, next to English, it is the most widely diffused language of the civilized world, as little read or spoken in England, France, or Germany. There are, however, other theories to account for the universal and scarcely intermitted political confusion which at times has reigned in all Central and South America, save Chile and the Brazilian Empire. It is said that the people are to a great extent of Indian blood, and that they have been trained in Roman Catholicism. Such arguments would be intelligible if they were used by persons who maintain that a highly special and exceptional political education is essential to the successful practice of popular government, but they proceed from those who believe that there is at least a strong presumption in favor of democratic institutions everywhere. And as regards the Roman Catholic Church, it should at least be remembered that, whatever else it may be, it is a great school of equality. I have now given shortly the actual history of popular government since it was introduced, in its modern shape, into the civilized world. I state the facts, as matter neither for congratulation nor for lamentation, but simply as materials for opinion. It is manifest that, so far as they go, they do little to support the assumption that popular government has an indefinitely long future before it. Experience rather tends to show that it is characterized by great fragility, and that, since its appearance, all forms of government have become more insecure than they were before. The true reason why the extremely accessible facts which I have noticed are so seldom observed and put together is that the enthusiasts for popular government, particularly when it reposes on a wide basis of suffrage, are actuated by much the same spirit as the zealots of legitimism. They assume their principle to have a sanction antecedent to fact. It is not thought to be in any way invalidated by practical violations of it, which merely constitute so many sins the more against imprescriptible right. The convinced partisans of democracy care little for instances which show democratic governments to be unstable. These are merely isolated triumphs of the principle of evil. But the conclusion of the sober student of history will not be of this kind. He will rather note it as a fact, to be considered in the most serious spirit, that since the century during which the Roman emperors were at the mercy of the praetorian soldiery, there has been no such insecurity of government as the world has seen since rulers became delegates of the community. Is it possible to assign any reasons for this singular modern loss of political equilibrium? I think that it is possible to a certain extent. It may be observed that two separate national sentiments have been acting on Western Europe since the beginning of the present century. To call them by names given to them by those who dislike them, one is imperialism and the other is radicalism. They are not in the least purely British forms of opinion, but are coextensive with civilization. Almost all men in our day are anxious that their country should be respected of all and dependent on none, that it should enjoy greatness and perhaps ascendancy, and this passion for national dignity has gone hand in hand with the desire of the many, ever more and more acquiesced in by the few, to have a share of political power under the name of liberty, and to govern by rulers who are their delegates. The two newest and most striking of political creations in Europe, the German Empire, and the Italian Kingdom, are joint products of these forces. But for the first of these coveted objects, imperial rank, great armies and fleets are indispensable, and it becomes ever more a necessity that the men under arms should be nearly coextensive with the whole of the males in the flower of life. It has yet to be seen how far great armies are consistent with popular government resting on a wide suffrage. No two organizations can be more opposed to one another than an army scientifically disciplined and equipped, and a nation democratically governed. The great military virtue is obedience, the great military sin is slackness in obeying. It is forbidden to decline to carry out orders, even with the clearest conviction of their inexpediency. But the chief democratic right is the right to censure superiors. Public opinion, which means censure as well as praise, is the motive force of democratic societies. The maxims of the two systems flatly contradict one another, and the man who would loyally obey both finds his moral constitution cut into two halves. It has been found by recent experience that the more popular the civil institutions, the harder it is to keep the army from meddling with politics. Military insurrections are made by officers, but not before every soldier has discovered that the share of power which belongs to him as a unit in a regiment is more valuable than his fragment of power as a unit in a constituency. Military revolts are of universal occurrence, but far the largest number have occurred in Spain and the Spanish-speaking countries. There have been ingenious explanations of the phenomenon, but the manifest explanation is habit. An army which has once interfered with politics is under a strong temptation to interfere again. It is a far easier and far more effective way of causing an opinion to prevail than going to a ballot box, and far more profitable to the leaders. I may add that, violent as is the improbability of military interference in some countries, there is probably no country except the United States in which the army could not control the government, if it were of one mind and if it retained its military material. Popular governments have been repeatedly overturned by the army and the mob in combination, but on the whole the violent destruction of these governments in their more extreme forms has been effected by the army, while in their more moderate shapes they have had the mob for their principal assailant. It is to be observed that in recent times mobs have materially changed both their character and their method of attack. A mob was once a portion of society in a state of dissolution, a collection of people who for the time had broken loose from the ties which bind society together. It may have had a vague preference for some political or religious cause, but the spirit which animated it was mainly one of mischief, or of disorder, or of panic. But mobs have now come more and more to be the organs of definite opinions. Spanish mobs have impartially worn all colors, but the French mob which overthrew the government of the elder Bourbons in 1830, while it had a distinct political object in its wish to defeat the aggressive measures of the king, had a further bias towards ultra-radicalism or republicanism, which showed itself strongly in the insurrectionary movements that followed the accession of Louis Philippe to the throne. The mob, which in 1848 overturned the government of the younger Bourbons, aimed at establishing a republic, but it had also a leaning to socialism, and the frightful popular insurrection of June 1848 was entirely socialistic. At present, whenever in Europe there is a disturbance like those created by the old mobs, it is in the interest of the parties which style themselves irreconcilable, and which refuse to submit their opinions to the arbitration of any governments, however wide be the popular suffrage on which they are based. But besides their character, mobs have changed their armament. They formerly wrought destruction by the undisciplined force of sheer numbers, but the mob of Paris, the most successful of all mobs, owed its success to the barricade. It has now lost this advantage, and a generation is coming to maturity, which perhaps will never have learned that the Paris of today has been entirely constructed with the view of rendering forever impossible the old barricade of paving stones in the narrow streets of the demolished city. Still more recently, however, the mob has obtained new arms. During the last quarter of a century, a great part, perhaps the greatest part, of the inventive faculties of mankind has been given to the arts of destruction, and among the newly discovered modes of putting an end to human life on a large scale, the most effective and terrible is a manipulation of explosive compounds quite unknown till the other day. The bomb of nitroglycerin and the parcel of dynamite are as characteristic of the new enemies of government as their irreconcilable opinions. There can be no more formidable symptom of our time, and none more menacing to popular government, than the growth of irreconcilable bodies within the mass of the population. Church and state are alike convulsed by them, but, in civil life, irreconcilables are associations of men who hold political opinions as men once held religious opinions. They cling to their creed with the same intensity of belief, the same immunity from doubt, the same confident expectation of blessedness to come quickly, which characterizes the disciples of an infant faith. They are doubtless a product of democratic sentiment, they have borrowed from it its promise of a new and good time at hand, but they insist on the immediate redemption of the pledge, and they utterly refuse to wait until a popular majority gives effect to their opinions. Nor would the vote of such a majority have the least authority with them, if it sanctioned any departure from their principles. It is possible, and indeed likely, that if the Russians voted by universal suffrage tomorrow, they would confirm the imperial authority by enormous majorities, but not a bomb nor an ounce of dynamite would be spared to the reigning emperor by the nihilists. The irreconcilables are of course at feud with governments of the older type, but these governments make no claim to their support. On the other hand, they are a portion of the governing body of democratic commonwealths, and from this vantage ground they are able to inflict deadly injury on popular government. There is in reality no closer analogy than between these infant political creeds and the belligerent religions which are constantly springing up even now in parts of the world, for instance, that of the Taipings in China. Even in our own country we may observe that the earliest political irreconcilables were religious or semi-religious zealots. Such were both the Independents and the Jacobites. Cromwell, who for many striking reasons might have been a personage of a much later age, was an irreconcilable at the head of an army, and we all know what he thought of the Parliament which anticipated the democratic assemblies of our day. Of all modern irreconcilables, the nationalists appear to be the most impracticable, and of all governments, popular governments seem least likely to cope with them successfully. Nobody can say exactly what nationalism is, and indeed the dangerousness of the theory arises from its vagueness. It seems full of the seeds of future civil convulsion. As it is sometimes put, it appears to assume that men of one particular race suffer injustice if they are placed under the same political institutions with men of another race. But race is quite as ambiguous a term as nationality. The earlier philologists had certainly supposed that the branches of mankind speaking languages of the same stock were somehow connected by blood, but no scholar now believes that this is more than approximately true, for conquest, contact, and the ascendancy of a particular literate class, have quite as much to do with community of language as common descent. Moreover, several of the communities claiming the benefit of the new theory are certainly not entitled to it. The Irish are an extremely mixed race, and it is only by a perversion of language that the Italians can be called a race at all. The fact is that any portion of a political society, which has had a somewhat different history from the rest of the parts, can take advantage of the theory and claim independence, and can thus threaten the entire society with dismemberment. Where royal authority survives in any vigor, it can to a certain extent deal with these demands. Almost all the civilized states derive their national unity from common subjection, past or present, to royal power. The Americans of the United States, for example, are a nation because they once obeyed a king. Hence too it is that such a miscellany of races as those which make up the Austro-Hungarian monarchy can be held together, at all events temporarily, by the authority of the emperor-king. But democracies are quite paralyzed by the plea of nationality. There is no more effective way of attacking them than by admitting the right of the majority to govern, but denying that the majority so entitled is the particular majority which claims the right. The difficulties of popular government, which arise from the modern military spirit and from the modern growth of irreconcilable parties, could not perhaps have been determined without actual experience. But there are other difficulties which might have been divined, because they proceed from the inherent nature of democracy. In stating some of them, I will endeavor to avoid those which are suggested by mere dislike or alarm. Those which I propose to specify were in reality noted more than 2 centuries ago by the powerful intellect of Hobbes, and it will be seen what light is thrown on some political phenomena of our day by a searching analysis. Political liberty, said Hobbes, is political power. When a man burns to be free, he is not longing for the desolate freedom of the wild ass, what he wants is a share of political government. But, in wide democracies, political power is minced into morsels, and each man's portion of it is almost infinitesimally small. One of the first results of this political comminution is described by Mr. Justice Stephen in a work of earlier date than that which I have quoted above. It is that 2 of the historical watchwords of democracy exclude one another, and that, where there is political liberty, there can be no equality. The man who can sweep the greatest number of fragments of political power into one heap will govern the rest. The strongest man in one form or another will always rule. If the government is a military one, the qualities which make a man a great soldier will make him a ruler. If the government is a monarchy, the qualities which kings value in counselors, in administrators, in generals, will give power. In a pure democracy, the ruling men will be the wire pullers and their friends, but they will be no more on an equality with the people than soldiers or ministers of state are on an equality with the subjects of a monarchy. In some ages, a powerful character, in others cunning, in others power of transacting business, in others eloquence, in others a good hold upon commonplaces and a facility in applying them to practical purposes, will enable a man to climb on his neighbor's shoulders and direct them this way or that, but under all circumstances the rank and file are directed by leaders of one kind or another who get the command of their collective force. There is no doubt that, in popular governments resting on a wide suffrage, either without an army or having little reason to fear it, the leader, whether or not he be cunning, or eloquent, or well provided with commonplaces, will be the wire puller. The process of cutting up political power into petty fragments has in him its most remarkable product. The morsels of power are so small that men, if left to themselves, would not care to employ them. In England, they would be largely sold, if the law permitted it. In the United States they are extensively sold in spite of the law, and in France, and to a less extent in England, the number of abstentions shows the small value attributed to votes. But the political chiffonier who collects and utilizes the fragments is the wire puller. I think, however, that it is too much the habit in this country to describe him as a mere organizer, contriver, and manager. The particular mechanism which he constructs is no doubt of much importance. The form of this mechanism recently erected in this country has a close resemblance to the system of the Wesleyan Methodists. One system, however, exists for the purpose of keeping the spirit of grace aflame, the other for maintaining the spirit of party at a white heat. The wire puller is not intelligible unless we take into account one of the strongest forces acting on human nature: party feeling. Party feeling is probably far more a survival of the primitive combativeness of mankind than a consequence of conscious intellectual differences between man and man. It is essentially the same sentiment which in certain states of society leads to civil, intertribal, or international war, and it is as universal as humanity. It is better studied in its more irrational manifestations than in those to which we are accustomed. It is said that Australian savages will travel half over the Australian continent to take in a fight the side of combatants who wear the same totem as themselves. Two Irish factions who broke one another's heads over the whole island are said to have originated in a quarrel about the color of a cow. In southern India, a series of dangerous riots are constantly arising through the rivalry of parties who know no more of one another than that some of them belong to the party of the right hand and others to that of the left hand. Once a year, large numbers of English ladies and gentlemen, who have no serious reason for preferring one university to the other, wear dark or light blue colors to signify good wishes for the success of Oxford or Cambridge in a cricket match or boat race. Party differences, properly so called, are supposed to indicate intellectual, or moral, or historical preferences, but these go a very little way down into the population, and by the bulk of partisans they are hardly understood and soon forgotten. Guelph and Ghibellin had once a meaning, but men were under perpetual banishment from their native land for belonging to one or other of these parties long after nobody knew in what the difference consisted. Some men are Tories or Whigs by conviction, but thousands upon thousands of electors vote simply for yellow, blue, or purple, caught at most by the appeals of some popular order. It is through this great natural tendency to take sides that the wire puller works. Without it he would be powerless. His business is to fan its flame, to keep it constantly acting upon the man who has once declared himself a partisan, to make escape from it difficult and distasteful. His art is that of the nonconformist preacher, who gave importance to a body of commonplace religionists by persuading them to wear a uniform and take a military title, or of the man who made the success of a temperance society by prevailing on its members to wear always and openly a blue ribbon. In the long run, these contrivances cannot be confined to any one party, and their effects on all parties and their leaders, and on the whole ruling democracy, must be in the highest degree serious and lasting. The first of these effects will be, I think, to make all parties very like one another, and indeed in the end almost indistinguishable, however leaders may quarrel and partisan hate partisan. In the next place, each party will probably become more and more homogeneous, and the opinions it professes, and the policy which is the outcome of those opinions, will less and less reflect the individual mind of any leader, but only the ideas which seem to that mind to be most likely to win favor with the greatest number of supporters. Lastly, the wire-pulling system, when fully developed, will infallibly lead to the constant enlargement of the area of suffrage. What is called universal suffrage has greatly declined in the estimation, not only of philosophers who follow Bentham, but of the a priori theorists who assumed that it was the inseparable accompaniment of a republic, but who found that in practice it was the natural basis of a tyranny. But extensions of the suffrage, though no longer believed to be good in themselves, have now a permanent place in the armory of parties, and are sure to be a favorite weapon of the wire puller. The Athenian statesmen who, worsted in a quarrel of aristocratic cliques, took the people into partnership, have a close parallel in the modern politicians who introduce household suffrage into towns to dish one side, and into counties to dish the other. Let us now suppose the competition of parties, stimulated to the utmost by the modern contrivances of the wire puller, to have produced an electoral system under which every adult male has a vote, and perhaps every adult female. Let us assume that the new machinery has extracted a vote from every one of these electors. How is the result to be expressed? It is, that the average opinion of a great multitude has been obtained, and that this average opinion becomes the basis and standard of all government and law. There is hardly any experience of the way in which such a system would work, except in the eyes of those who believe that history began since their own birth. The universal suffrage of white males in the United States is about 50 years old, that of white and black is less than 20. The French threw away universal suffrage after the Reign of Terror. It was twice revived in France, that the Napoleonic tyranny might be founded on it, and it was introduced into Germany, that the personal power of Prince Bismarck might be confirmed. But one of the strangest of vulgar ideas is that a very wide suffrage could or would promote progress, new ideas, new discoveries and inventions, new arts of life. Such a suffrage is commonly associated with radicalism, and no doubt amid its most certain effects would be the extensive destruction of existing institutions, but the chances are that, in the long run, it would produce a mischievous form of conservatism, and drug society with a potion compared with which L-theanine would be a salutary draught. For to what end, towards what ideal state, is the process of stamping upon law the average opinion of an entire community directed? The end arrived at is identical with that of the Roman Catholic Church, which attributes a similar sacredness to the average opinion of the Christian world. Quod semper, quod ubique, quod ab omnibus, was the canon of Vincent of Lerone. Securus judicat orbis terrarum, were the words which rang in the ears of Newman and produced such marvelous effects on him. But did anyone in his senses ever suppose that these were maxims of progress? The principles of legislation at which they point would probably put an end to all social and political activities, and arrest everything which has ever been associated with liberalism. A moment's reflection will satisfy any competently instructed person that this is not too broad a proposition. Let him turn over in his mind the great epochs of scientific invention and social change during the last 2 centuries, and consider what would have occurred if universal suffrage had been established at any one of them. Universal suffrage, which today excludes free trade from the United States, would certainly have prohibited the spinning jenny and the power loom. It would certainly have forbidden the threshing machine. It would have prevented the adoption of the Gregorian calendar, and it would have restored the Stuarts. It would have proscribed the Roman Catholics with the mob which burned Lord Mansfield's house and library in 1780, and it would have proscribed the dissenters with the mob which burned Dr. Priestley's house and library in 1791. There are possibly many persons who, without denying these conclusions in the past, tacitly assume that no such mistakes will be committed in the future, because the community is already too enlightened for them, and will become more enlightened through popular education. But without questioning the advantages of popular education under certain aspects, its manifest tendency is to diffuse popular commonplaces, to fasten them on the mind at the time when it is most easily impressed, and thus to stereotype average opinion. It is of course possible that universal suffrage would not now force on governments the same legislation which it would infallibly have dictated 100 years ago, but then we are necessarily ignorant what germs of social and material improvement there may be in the womb of time, and how far they may conflict with the popular prejudice which hereafter will be omnipotent. There is in fact just enough evidence to show that even now there is a marked antagonism between democratic opinion and scientific truth as applied to human societies. The central seat in all political economy was from the first occupied by the theory of population. This theory has now been generalized by Mr. Darwin and his followers, and, stated as the principle of the survival of the fittest, it has become the central truth of all biological science. Yet it is evidently disliked by the multitude, and thrust into the background by those whom the multitude permits to lead it. It has long been intensely unpopular in France and the continent of Europe, and, among ourselves, proposals for recognizing it through the relief of distress by emigration are visibly being supplanted by schemes founded on the assumption that, through legislative experiments on society, a given space of land may always be made to support and comfort the population which from historical causes has come to be settled on it. It is perhaps hoped that this opposition between democracy and science, which certainly does not promise much for the longevity of popular government, may be neutralized by the ascendancy of instructed leaders. Possibly the proposition would not be very unsafe, that he who calls himself a friend of democracy because he believes that it will be always under wise guidance is in reality, whether he knows it or not, an enemy of democracy. But at all events the signs of our time are not at all a favorable augury for the future direction of great multitudes by statesmen wiser than themselves. The relation of political leaders to political followers seems to me to be undergoing a twofold change. The leaders may be as able and eloquent as ever, and some of them certainly appear to have an unprecedentedly good hold upon commonplaces, and a facility in applying them, but they are manifestly listening nervously at one end of a speaking tube which receives at its other end the suggestions of a lower intelligence. On the other hand, the followers, who are really the rulers, are manifestly becoming impatient of the hesitations of their nominal chiefs, and the wrangling of their representatives. I am very desirous of keeping aloof from questions disputed between the two great English parties, but it certainly seems to me that all over continental Europe, and to some extent in the United States, parliamentary debates are becoming ever more formal and perfunctory. They are more and more liable to being peremptorily cut short, and the true springs of policy are more and more limited to clubs and associations deep below the level of the highest education and experience. There is one state or group of states, whose political condition deserves particular attention. This is Switzerland, a country to which the student of politics may always look with advantage for the latest forms and results of democratic experiment. About 40 years ago, just when Mr. Grote was giving to the world the earliest volumes of his History of Greece, he published 7 letters on the recent politics of Switzerland, explaining that his interest in the Swiss cantons arose from their presenting a certain analogy nowhere else to be found in Europe to the ancient Greek states. Now, if Grote had one object more than another at heart in writing his history, it was to show, by the example of the Athenian democracy, that wide popular governments, so far from meriting the reproach of fickleness, are sometimes characterized by the utmost tenacity of attachment, and will follow the counsels of a wise leader, like Pericles, at the cost of any amount of suffering, and may even be led by an unwise leader, like Nicias, to the very verge of destruction. But he had the acuteness to discern in Switzerland the particular democratic institution, which was likely to tempt democracies into dispensing with prudent and independent direction. He speaks with the strongest disapproval of a provision in the Constitution of Lucerne, by which all laws, passed by the Legislative Council, were to be submitted for veto or sanction to the vote of the people throughout the canton. This was originally a contrivance of the ultra-Catholic party, and was intended to neutralize the opinions of the Catholic liberals, by bringing to bear on them the average opinion of the whole cantonal population. A year after Mr. Grote had published his 7 letters, the French Revolution of 1848 occurred, and, 3 years later, the violent overthrow of the democratic institutions established by the French National Assembly was consecrated by the very method of voting which he had condemned, under the name of the plebiscite. The arguments of the French Liberal Party against the plebiscite, during the 20 years of stern despotism which it entailed upon France, have always appeared to me to be arguments in reality against the very principle of democracy. After the misfortunes of 1870, the Bonapartes and the plebiscite were alike involved in the deepest unpopularity, but it seems impossible to doubt that Gambetta, by his agitation for the scrutin de liste, was attempting to recover as much as he could of the plebiscitary system of voting. Meantime, it has become, in various shapes, one of the most characteristic of Swiss institutions. One article of the federal constitution provides that, if 50,000 Swiss citizens, entitled to vote, demand the revision of the constitution, the question whether the constitution be revised shall be put to the vote of the people of Switzerland, aye or no. Another enacts that, on the petition of 30,000 citizens, every federal law and every federal decree, which is not urgent, shall be subject to the referendum, that is, it shall be put to the popular vote. These provisions, that when a certain number of voters demand a particular measure, or require a further sanction for a particular enactment, it shall be put to the vote of the whole country, seems to me to have a considerable future before them in democratically governed societies. When Mr. Labouchere told the House of Commons in 1882 that the people were tired of the deluge of debate, and would someday substitute for it the direct consultation of the constituencies, he had more facts to support his opinion than his auditors were perhaps aware of. Here then we have one great inherent infirmity of popular governments, an infirmity deducible from the principle of Hobbes, that liberty is power cut into fragments. Popular governments can only be worked by a process which incidentally entails the further subdivision of the morsels of political power, and thus the tendency of these governments, as they widen their electoral basis, is towards a dead level of commonplace opinion, which they are forced to adopt as the standard of legislation and policy. The evils likely to be thus produced are rather those vulgarly associated with ultra-conservatism than those of ultra-radicalism. So far indeed as the human race has experience, it is not by political societies in any way resembling those now called democracies that human improvement has been carried on. History, said Strauss, and, considering his actual part in life, this is perhaps the last opinion which might have been expected from him. History is a sound aristocrat. There may be oligarchies close enough and jealous enough to stifle thought as completely as an oriental despot who is at the same time the pontiff of a religion, but the progress of mankind has hitherto been effected by the rise and fall of aristocracies, by the formation of one aristocracy within another, or by the succession of one aristocracy to another. There have been so-called democracies, which have rendered services beyond price to civilization, but they were only peculiar forms of aristocracy. The short-lived Athenian democracy, under whose shelter art, science, and philosophy shot so wonderfully upwards, was only an aristocracy which rose on the ruins of one much narrower. The splendor which attracted the original genius of the then civilized world to Athens was provided by the severe taxation of 1,000 subject cities, and the skilled laborers who worked under Phidias, and who built the Parthenon, were slaves. The infirmities of popular government, which consist in its occasional wanton destructiveness, have been frequently dwelt upon and require less attention. In the long run, the most interesting question which they suggest is, to what social results does the progressive overthrow of existing institutions promise to conduct mankind? I will again quote Mr. Labouchere, who is not the less instructive because he may perhaps be suspected of taking a certain malicious pleasure in stating roundly what many persons who employ the same political watchwords as himself are reluctant to say in public, and possibly shrink from admitting to themselves in their own minds. Democrats are told that they are dreamers, and why? Because they assert that, if power be placed in the hands of the many will exercise it for their own benefit. Is it not a still wilder dream to suppose that the many will in future possess power, and use it not to secure what they consider to be their interests, but to serve those of others? Is it imagined that artisans in our great manufacturing towns are so satisfied with their present position that they will hurry to the polls, to register their votes in favor of a system which divides us socially, politically, and economically, into classes, and places them at the bottom with hardly a possibility of rising? Is the lot of the agricultural laborer so happy a one that he will humbly and cheerfully affix his cross to the name of the man who tells him that it can never be changed for the better? We know that artisans and agricultural laborers will approach the consideration of political and social problems with fresh and vigorous minds. For the moment, we demand the equalization of the franchise. Our next demands will be electoral districts, cheap elections, payment of members, and abolition of hereditary legislators. When our demands are complied with, we shall be thankful, but we shall not rest. On the contrary, having forged an instrument for democratic legislation, we shall use it. The persons who charged Mr. Labouchere with dreaming because he thus predicted the probable course, and defined the natural principles, of future democratic legislation, seem to me to have done him much injustice. His forecast of political events is extremely rational, and I cannot but agree with him in thinking it absurd to suppose that, if the hard-toiled and the needy, the artisan and the agricultural laborer, become the depositaries of power, and if they can find agents through whom it becomes possible for them to exercise it, they will not employ it for what they may be led to believe are their own interests. But in an inquiry whether, independently of the alarm or enthusiasm which they excite in certain persons or classes, democratic institutions contain any seed of dissolution or extinction, Mr. Labouchere's speculation becomes most interesting just where it stops. What is to be the nature of the legislation by which the lot of the artisan and of the agricultural laborer is to be not merely altered for the better, but exchanged for whatever station and fortune they may think it possible to confer on themselves by their own supreme authority? Mr. Labouchere's language, in the above passage and in other parts of his paper, like that of many persons who agree with him in the belief that government can indefinitely increase human happiness, undoubtedly suggests the opinion that the stock of good things in the world is practically unlimited in quantity, that it is, so to speak, contained in a vast storehouse or granary, and that out of this it is now doled in unequal shares and unfair proportions. It is this unfairness and inequality which democratic law will some day correct. Now I am not concerned to deny that, at various times during the history of mankind, narrow oligarchies have kept too much of the wealth of the world to themselves, or that false economical systems have occasionally diminished the total supply of wealth, and, by their indirect operation, have caused it to be irrationally distributed. Yet nothing is more certain than that the mental picture which enchains the enthusiasts for benevolent democratic government is altogether false, and that, if the mass of mankind were to make an attempt at redividing the common stock of good things, they would resemble, not a number of claimants insisting on the fair division of a fund, but a mutinous crew, feasting on a ship's provisions, gorging themselves on the meat and intoxicating themselves with the liquors, but refusing to navigate the vessel to port. It is among the simplest of economical truths, that far the largest part of the wealth of the world is constantly perishing by consumption, and that, if it be not renewed by perpetual toil and adventure, either the human race, or the particular community making the experiment of resting without being thankful, will be extinguished or brought to the very verge of extinction. This position, although it depends in part on a truth of which, according to John Stuart Mill, nobody is habitually aware who has not bestowed some thought on the matter, admits a very simple illustration. It used to be a question hotly debated among economists how it was that countries recovered with such surprising rapidity from the effects of the most destructive and desolating wars. An enemy lays waste a country by fire and sword, and destroys or carries away nearly all the movable wealth existing in it, and yet, in a few years after, everything is much as it was before. Mill, following Chalmers, gives the convincing explanation that nothing in such a case has happened which would not have occurred in any circumstances. What the enemy has destroyed would have been destroyed in a little time by the inhabitants themselves. The wealth which they so rapidly reproduce would have needed to be reproduced and would have been reproduced in any case, and probably in as short an interval. In fact, the fund by which the life of the human race and of each particular society is sustained, is never in a statical condition. It is no more in that condition than is a cloud in the sky, which is perpetually dissolving and perpetually renewing itself. Everything which is produced is consumed, both what is saved and what is said to be spent, and the former quite as rapidly as the latter. The wealth of mankind is the result of a continuing process, everywhere complex and delicate, and nowhere of such complexity and delicacy as in the British Islands. So long as this process goes on under existing influences, it is not, as we have seen, interrupted by earthquake, flood, or war, and, at each of its steps, the wealth which perishes and revives has a tendency to increase. But if we alter the character or diminish the force of these influences, are we sure that wealth, instead of increasing, will not dwindle and perhaps disappear? Mill notes an exception to the revival of a country after war. It may be depopulated, and if there are not men to carry it on, the process of reproduction will stop. But may it not be arrested by any means short of exterminating the population? An experience, happily now rare in the world, shows that wealth may come very near to perishing through diminished energy in the motives of the men who reproduce it. You may, so to speak, take the heart and spirit out of the laborers to such an extent that they do not care to work. Jeremy Bentham observed about a century ago that the Turkish government had in his day impoverished some of the richest countries in the world far more by its action on motives than by its positive exactions, and it has always appeared to me that the destruction of the vast wealth accumulated under the Roman Empire, one of the most orderly and efficient of governments, and the decline of Western Europe into the squalor and poverty of the Middle Ages, can only be accounted for on the same principle. The failure of reproduction through relaxation of motives was once an everyday phenomenon in the East, and this explains to students of Oriental history why it is that throughout its course a reputation for statesmanship was always a reputation for financial statesmanship. In the early days of the East India Company, villages broken by a severe settlement were constantly calling for the attention of the government. The assessment on them did not appear to be excessive on English fiscal principles, but it had been heavy enough to press down the motives to labor, so that they could barely recover themselves. The phenomenon, however, is not confined to the East, where no doubt the motives to toil are more easily affected than in Western societies. No later than the end of the last century, large portions of the French peasantry ceased to cultivate their land, and large numbers of French artisans declined to work, in despair at the vast requisitions of the revolutionary government during the Reign of Terror, and, as might be expected, the penal law had to be called in to compel their return to their ordinary occupations. It is perfectly possible, I think, as Mr. Herbert Spencer has shown in a recent admirable volume, to revive even in our day the fiscal tyranny which once left even European populations in doubt whether it was worth while preserving life by thrift and toil. You have only to tempt a portion of the population into temporary idleness by promising them a share in a fictitious hoard lying, as Mill puts it, in an imaginary strongbox which is supposed to contain all human wealth. You have only to take the heart out of those who would willingly labor and save, by taxing them ad misericordiam for the most laudable philanthropic objects. For it makes not the smallest difference to the motives of the thrifty and industrious part of mankind whether their fiscal oppressor be an Eastern despot, or a feudal baron, or a democratic legislature, and whether they are taxed for the benefit of a corporation called society, or for the advantage of an individual styled king or lord. Here then is the great question about democratic legislation, when carried to more than a moderate length. How will it affect human motives? What motives will it substitute for those now acting on men? The motives, which at present impel mankind to the labor and pain which produce the resuscitation of wealth in ever-increasing quantities, are such as infallibly to entail inequality in the distribution of wealth. They are the springs of action called into activity by the strenuous and never-ending struggle for existence, the beneficent private war which makes one man strive to climb on the shoulders of another and remain there through the law of the survival of the fittest. These truths are best exemplified in the part of the world to which the superficial thinker would perhaps look for the triumph of the opposite principle. The United States have justly been called the home of the disinherited of the earth, but, if those vanquished under one sky in the struggle for existence had not continued under another the same battle in which they had been once worsted, there would have been no such exploit performed as the cultivation of the vast American territory from end to end and from side to side. There could be no grosser delusion than to suppose this result to have been attained by democratic legislation. It has really been obtained through the sifting out of the strongest by natural selection. The government of the United States, which I examine in another part of this volume, now rests on universal suffrage, but then it is only a political government. It is a government under which coercive restraint, except in politics, is reduced to a minimum. There has hardly ever before been a community in which the weak have been pushed so pitilessly to the wall, in which those who have succeeded have so uniformly been the strong, and in which in so short a time there has arisen so great an inequality of private fortune and domestic luxury. And at the same time, there has never been a country in which, on the whole, the persons distanced in the race have suffered so little from their ill success. All this beneficent prosperity is the fruit of recognizing the principle of population, and the one remedy for its success in perpetual emigration. It all reposes on the sacredness of contract and the stability of private property, the first the implement, and the last the reward, of success in the universal competition. These, however, are all principles and institutions which the British friends of the artisan and agricultural labourer seem not a little inclined to treat as their ancestors did agricultural and industrial machinery. The Americans are still of opinion that more is to be got for human happiness by private energy than by public legislation. The Irish, however, even in the United States, are of another opinion, and the Irish opinion is manifestly rising into favour here. But on the question, whether future democratic legislation will follow the new opinion, the prospects of popular government to a great extent depend. There are two sets of motives, and two only, by which the great bulk of the materials of human subsistence and comfort have hitherto been produced and reproduced. One has led to the cultivation of the territory of the northern states of the American Union, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The other had a considerable share in bringing about the industrial and agricultural progress of the southern states, and in old days it produced the wonderful prosperity of Peru under the Incas. One system is economical competition, the other consists in the daily task, perhaps fairly and kindly allotted, but enforced by the prison or the scourge. So far as we have any experience to teach us, we are driven to the conclusion that every society of men must adopt one system or the other, or it will pass through penury to starvation. I have thus shown that popular governments of the modern type have not hitherto proved stable as compared with other forms of political rule, and that they include certain sources of weakness which do not promise security for them in the near or remote future. My chief conclusion can only be stated negatively. There is not at present sufficient evidence to warrant the common belief that these governments are likely to be of indefinitely long duration. There is, however, one positive conclusion from which no one can escape who bases a forecast of the prospects of popular government, not on moral preference or a priori assumption, but on actual experience as witnessed to by history. If there be any reason for thinking that constitutional freedom will last, it is a reason furnished by a particular set of facts, with which Englishmen ought to be familiar, but of which many of them, under the empire of prevailing ideas, are exceedingly apt to miss the significance. The British Constitution has existed for a considerable length of time, and therefore free institutions generally may continue to exist. I am quite aware that this will seem to some a commonplace conclusion, perhaps as commonplace as the conclusion of M. Taine, who, after describing the conquest of all France by the Jacobin Club, declares that his inference is so simple, that he hardly ventures to state it. Jusqu'à présent, je n'ai guère trouvé qu'un principe, si simple qu'il semble apurel et que j'ose à peine tenancer. Tout consiste tout entier dans cette remarque, qu'une société humaine, surtout une société moderne, est une chose vaste et compliquée. This observation, that a human society, and particularly a modern society, is a vast and complicated thing, is in fact the very proposition which Burke enforced with all the splendor of his eloquence and all the power of his argument, but, as M. Taine says, it may now seem to some too simple and commonplace to be worth putting into words. In the same way, many persons in whom familiarity has bred contempt, may think it a trivial observation that the British Constitution, if not, as some call it, a holy thing, is a thing unique and remarkable. A series of undesigned changes brought it to such a condition, that satisfaction and impatience, the two great sources of political conduct, were both reasonably gratified under it. In this condition it became, not metaphorically but literally, the envy of the world, and the world took on all sides to copying it. The imitations have not been generally happy. One nation alone, consisting of Englishmen, has practiced a modification of it successfully, amidst abounding material plenty. It is not too much to say, that the only evidence worth mentioning for the duration of popular government is to be found in the success of the British Constitution during 2 centuries under special conditions, and in the success of the American Constitution during 1 century under conditions still more peculiar and more unlikely to recur. Yet, so far as our own Constitution is concerned, that nice balance of attractions, which caused it to move evenly on its stately path, is perhaps destined to be disturbed. One of the forces governing it may gain dangerously at the expense of the other, and the British political system, with the national greatness and material prosperity attendant on it, may yet be launched into space and find its last affinities in silence and cold.